Day 6 of 11 Days of Remembrance. Chapter 6 in the fall of Hong Kong into Japan. Prisoner of War, 1942 to 1945. Delivered at the last moment from death on the battlefield, we now faced an uncertain future and a new challenge: how to survive at the hands of our brutal captors. On the 30th of December, we were marched across the island from Stanley to North Point, on the northern shore of the island. North Point had been a Chinese refugee center before the war and was now to serve as our prison camp. Nearly 4 years of starvation, malnutrition, and torture were about to begin as we marched from Stanley to the North Camp. Our brigade halted to the Marshman Common near Lake Mun, very close to where the main Japanese force and come ashore. As we sat racing beside the road, a blood-stained, covered Dishvafag entered up and asked to join us. Where had he been? We told as he was a cook helper in the Royal Rifles, and we was working with Sergeant Cook Gary's cousins. Prepared food at Lei Mun, where the Japanese invaders broke into their kitchen. All day they were forced to unload ammunition from Japanese landing briggers and carry it ashore. As the sun began to set, they were both lined up on the road beside a deep ditch, hand-tied behind their backs, and bayoneted. They fell into the ditch and were left for dead. When the assistant cook regained consciousness, it was still dark, and he found his way lying under Sergeant Cousin's corpse. His wounds had stopped bleeding, and he was some miracle that returned first. He missed his vital organs. He was in pain, but he found he could move. Somehow he worked his hands free of their bonds. After a long and painful struggle, he examined himself from under his dead sergeant and colonel over the edge of the ditch. The road above him was occupied by Japanese reinforcement marching in haste to support their forward movement of battle. At least a break in the traffic, covered in his, would be able to crawl from the ditch and ditch himself from the road. He was covered with blood, dressed only in his light fatigues, had no food, and by now was deprived for water. On all fours he crawled away from the road until he came upon a heavily built steel and concrete shelter with a massive steel door that had been used to protect C Company personnel from Japanese shell fire. He crawled inside, closed and booted the door, and passed out again. While he came to began to explore his self-imposed dungeon and past darkness, he discovered that its past occupants had left him half a package of army biscuits, a container of water, and a large jar of rum. Which to do? He was now behind Japanese lines. He knew of the danger of infection to the far deep rooms. He had food, water, perhaps for 2 or 3 days the most, and the rum if he found able. The massive door and was discovered. He knew he would be summarily executed by the Japanese, but on the other hand, if he prevent his presence sanctuary, it would be soon be not held heading place but his tomb. He lay in the dark, slipping and of consciousness until he lost all track of time. Suddenly he was awakened by a fleeing, rattled, and heavy thud to the door. A Japanese mop-up force was at the shelter. They attempted for a half an hour to batter down the door with no success. The door held. Later, perhaps a day or so later, he was awakened by an explosion. Someone was trying to blast their way into the shelter, but again the door held. After being held up in the shelter for about 11 days, the pangs of hunger and thirst drove him to open the door to begin a desperate search for food and water. When he opened the door, it was broad daylight. As he crept out of the shelter and door to the road, he heard the unmistakable sound of the English language. He crept closer until he could see a long line of armed, khaki-clad Canadian soldiers resting by the side of the road. He survived the bayoneting in the Japanese prison camps, and nearly 4 years later he made it home with his scars to support his incredible story. North Point Camp had been a battleground where the Japanese had initially landed, and it was surrounded with the littered with the dead and decomposing bodies of men and pack animals. They later felt stinks of the dead were awful and a prepared place for millions of rifles. The hunt were riddled with shrapnel, and there were no running water, no lanterns, no cooking facilities, and no food or water for the prisoners. They grounded with prolonged up by shell fire and coated the wreckage of the battle. Upon the foil, the men of many and well exhausted soon laid the ground or the cement floor of the shattered windowless huts. The crowding of the firearms, such as they were made for hopeless conjunction, lice, fleas, and bedbugs were rampant. There was no soap and not even the slightest items of hygiene, such as toothbrushes, were available. The men were filthy and battle-stained. Within a short time, many were infected by the cloud of disease-carrying fleas and began to succumb to a virulent form of antibiotic dysentery. There were no medical supplies, no hospital, and no provisions for the sick and the wounded. The seriously wounded and the certain cases lay on their stretchers where we had carried them. They were now collected their own blood and filled with quarreling with fleas. There was our invitation to a Japanese camp and to how the Japanese treated their prisoners. When food was finally issued the next day, it consisted of moldy rice full of rat droppings and worms. Our rations were 2 bowls of rice per day, one in the morning and one in the evening, and once surrounded one per man at noon. Nutritionists had calculated that in order to maintain health and weight, a soldier or average male engaged in manual labor requires 3,500 calories per day. It is estimated that a North Point camp where the diet consumed almost entirely rice, different mum tops. The caloric intake per prisoner was about 1,200 calories. Added to the lack of calories in the daily diet, the service of vitamins such as the B complex such to maintain health. Lieutenant Colonel Suffrage, commanding officer at the Grenadiers, was the first to die of malnutrition in the average condition. He was soon followed by many others. Sergeant Lance Ross, my fellow sergeant in D Company at great risk for himself, kept a secret diary. Here are some of the entries made at North Point. January 2nd, 1942. Very fine day, since is irritable. We put ground over some of the bodies. February 13th. We are almost frozen and our roof leaks awful. February 16th. Dysentery is widespread throughout the camp. February 18th. I believe we are getting to starve to death. February 22nd. We are terribly hungry. Just talk about food. March 1st. We are getting lousy at coats. We are crowded so close together. February 23rd. Rice and water 3 times a day. April 20th. Hitler's birthday. Also, Aunt Bessie many more to her. May 14th. Japanese knocked out a Chinese and left them out the streets outside the camp in the rain all day. As before dark, bayoneted him. He was alive this morning. May 16th. Japanese have 2 Chinese women tied to a post. They have shot their husbands. May 25th. Heat getting bad, 110 degrees Celsius in the shade. Mosquitoes eating us alive. June 13th. Japanese say they're attacking Alutans. Bedbugs getting worse. June 30th. Food is awful. Rice in the morning, bun dinner, some kind of greens like weeds. Well, at least he got food. And if I was in that situation, I think I would like to eat the rice because I'd be starving by that point. And I wouldn't be spoiled at all. At first, probably I would have been, but by June 30th, if they're giving me food to eat, I would just eat anything by that point. July 14th. Heavy rain all night. Sleep outdoors on concrete. So many bugs. August 12th. Man died. Many going blind. Gradually getting weaker. August 16th. Conditions getting unbearable. We will all die in this terrible place. August 17th. Hot. 100 degrees Celsius in the shade. 2 men died last night. September 1st. Rain and mud. First man of succession died with dysentery. September 11th. More men falling sick every day. December 12th. Another died today. We wrapped him in a sheet, buried him across the road. September 14th. Another death in my platoon. Pneumonia. September 19th. Very hot. Men dying at a rate of 3 a day. Malaria, dysentery, fever, more sick, some going blind. 3 died today. December 21st. 3 died today. December 26th. Went to shampoo. The bar racks are bombed and shelled. Not a window left. As I sat down these locations of our prisoner camp, I wonder now that any of us survived at North Point. We knew that we were slowly starving to death, but we also knew that a boost of antibiotic dysentery would spread up the process and almost like an unhindered death. Geoffrey C. Martin, a member of the Royal Rifles, recalled his account with dysentery at the North French Fells. In the second week of July 1942, with the rain pressing down, I was expecting present bowel movements following a stressed stomach cramps, nausea, and weakness. At first, I thought it was a bad case of diarrhea caused by internal disorders due to the terrible diet that we endured, but I was wrong. Nothing long afterwards, I noticed my stool shaken with blood and mucus and really kind of judiciary was rackling my body. Committed to the camp's local hospital with local unbearable stench. I was held to a cot and highly rained on. It was rain that was seeping through the roof. Next to me lay a very young-looking comrade who was booming for breath. I was certain he was puzzling more and more into a state of no return. The atmosphere was frightening. Patients were trotting at a snail pace along a narrow, closed corridor, the end of the world that was used to as a toilet. There was unable to mutter the stench to other the so-called beds laying in their own muck. Dirty blood stains full of toilet paper littered the floor. Mustering into strength to pay a toilet call, I recalled back from the awful stench of the room, containing nothing more than 5 peanut oil cans that were in constant use, and there who could not control their body functions had to use the floor. Cakes of extreme and pools of urine lay everywhere. The filth product of malaria of rats who was scrambling in the large numbers. We were deathly afraid that they would attack or bottlenecks. They were devastating chunks of flesh, time and again. Orderly tried to save them out of long throats, and the bunch of our officers confirmed that Japanese and certain that their referred decaying roof provided toilet facilities, but the Japanese were determined to refuse to do so and declared in anger that if they were further bothered, all prisoners would be subject to a cut in food rations. The rodents that were swimming around the floating muck tried to climb into our bed. Some succeeded and began attacking the flesh of patients, but they didn't feel it. The flesh was dead. The lady next to me explained that I watched as the orderly dropped his eyes and suffered his mouth and trimmed with cotton and wool and wrapped the remains in a blanket, then placed it on a stretcher and took it away. Our doctors and orderlies worked financially as around the clock to save those who were still clinging on to a shred of life. Without any source of medicine, the other alternatives to combat the disease was no intake of food for several days to stabilize the infants. Only tea was given several times daily. Our predators even lived the straining comfort us. On the third day, I could feel my strength rapidly declining. I could not raise myself off the bed. I was growing weaker and weaker. The room was spinning like a top, with the sounds around me giving dismay. Merchant was one of those few who recovered, and was later shipped to Japan, where he survived the war, his weight falling to 92 pounds before he released in northern Japan in September 1945. Escape seemed impossible because of our inability to speak Chinese, our inability to merge with the population, and our lack of water transportation. Despite these obstacles, on August 19, 1942, a sergeant and Youngsman escaped from the camp. They were quickly recaptured and tortured for a week in front of Colonel Takako and then beheaded. Their remains have never been found. In September 1942, after 9 months in the hellhole, we were moved from North Point Camp on the island to Semple Camp on the mainland. Here the crawling was less of a problem, but now you faced to work every day with pick and shovels, lengthening the runways of Keokuk Airport with no improvement in rations. It was here that we were exposed to the notorious Columbus Kid. He was an interpreter for the Japanese who had been born in Columbus, British Columbia, of Japanese parents, and moved to Japan before the war. His name was Ken no Injo, and he was charged with torturing, releasing, and the deaths of 4 men and women. And it was his favorite torture to the interrogators as the water torture, the flying airplane, and the hanging torture. He was a sadistic maniac who vented his sickness and the violence, torture, and abuse of his Canadian countrymen. By now, I had been promoted to warrant officer, and I stood by a helpless fury, and I watched him abuse my men. At the end of the war, he was captured at Hong Kong, tried and executed by an Allied court for his conduct at Shampoo. It was at Shampoo that the outbreak of diphtheria added to the surge of dysentery, malaria, and malnutrition. In October 1942, diphtheria reigns among the prisoners at an epidemic that lasted for 6 months. At its height, men died every day. By the end of this period, another 54 men in a regiment had needlessly died as a combination of malnutrition and diphtheria. The Japanese refused to supply serum to fight the disease and showed a calculus inhibition to our doctors. Repeated pleas for some of any of the medicines for those affected, ended up providing serum of some of our assistants to doctors. Dr. Sato, the ranking Japanese medical officer, accused our doctors and our allies of neglecting their patients for the less they had beaten by now. After more than 16 months of captivity, almost every prisoner suffered from biliary, dysentery, partial blindness, their tropical urines, and surgeon skin infections. Added to the infections was electric feet, caused by malnutrition, in which the victim exposed to pain like metal needles being put into the flesh night and day without relief. Dr. Stanley Bennett, a medical officer of the Royal Rifles, remembers his experience in Shampoo Falls. The first 4 months after our move to Shampoo, September 1942 to January 1943, were the most impotent and desperate pressing of our intention. I think the chief factors that made this so fortunate malnutrition epidemic, the Japanese were engaging in clearing away the debris of war, were lightening the landing strip at Kikat. The Japanese demanded a certain number of men each day, and the quota high. Eventually, it became clear, even to our captors, that they were asking the impossible of sick, exhausted men, and the work rations were discontinued. The food and injury in both amount and kind. Rice and green horror was hardly any fats, and an occasional minute ration of fish was near starvation to us. As a result, we developed our nutrition and the aggression of the tropical disease, and those spread by our cowering that hit us. The result was dangerous. At Sunny Fork Canadian developing diphtheria before we could get any annexations, and at least 54 died. We were starting having dust a day. The Japanese became alarmed. Possible the disease was spreading to their troops, and their seniors demanded action. They began swabbing throats to detect anyone on pain or punishment water a face mask day and night. Those show their fear of criticism by ordering the diphtheria should not appear as the cause of death in our reports. Most surprising, Dr. Sato, chief medical officer of the Hong Kong prisoner of war camps, lined up all medical personnel, mostly devout volunteers, and slapped their faces for permitting those patients to die. Our physicians alarmed were mostly due to malnutrition and could only have been traced by food. We everyday disease, corona, and praria. We all saw the unpleasantment of shovel sleep-robbing pain of hot foot was alarming, credible to the victim, and credible sometimes sudden blindness. Featured wholesome we affect imagine tropical onshore. Those who could not stand the psychological and emotional shock of these conditions and the starvation tactics and severity of capture died to escape. What for them was intolerable. They were a small minority. For the rest, we men strict discipline, daily ordered and crime sheets for disobedience of any orders were in effect. We were an organized military unit with its formal structure and ranks intact and fully operational. No unit was left outside the formal regiment, and each individual was reminded that he was a Canadian soldier who was only temporarily under the control of Japanese. I have no doubt that the discipline and philosophy saved countless lives and provided concrete support for the surviving of the strong to let officers' comrades down through personal weakness. I was that little victory, no matter what. Under these conditions, the men of rifles were militia as a whole. They again showed their courage despite the strength. A great deal has been written about the cruelty of the Japanese towards prisoners. To me, Japanese cruelty could not be exchanged. I personally witnessed their actual behavior, and they were savage and the extreme. Once around the behind were no restraints like madmen. However, I found in the private soldiers themselves, especially if they were combat troops out of sight of their officers, little of their fractious cruelty. In fact, they sometimes turned a blind eye to prisoners. And in fact, if the rules would, if disproved, were their superiors, they said often, I believed them, that they hated the war as much as we did. During the debate afternoon, a Japanese military interpreter who in peacetime was a Christian minister smuggled into the camp against orders a large amount of divine serum that saved hundreds of lives. He was discovered and arrested and court-martialed. No doubt he was executed for his crimes. In 1943, the Japanese began shipping prisoners of war from Hong Kong to Japan to work as slave labor. On January 19th of that year, I was sent on a draft to Japan with 663 of our men from Central. I embarked in Hong Kong harbor as a Japanese vessel, Chinomachu, for a run through the American submarine-infested waters of the China Sea. On our way to Nagasaki in Southwest Japan, we were bottled down in a cargo hold below. The hold was so crowded that only half of us got finished down at one time. There was no pleasure in the suffering but rice or water down twice daily from the deck above our lantern bucket. We entered once day. They dropped more of us, made up of British prisoners sailing on the unmarked Japanese ship. Lesbon Maru had been torpedoed and sunk by an American submarine, which fearful loss of life when the Japanese aboard the ship, leaving their prisoners down below deck under battled down hatches. There were escaped drowning were machine gunned in the water by Japanese escort ships, and if those only handful escaped by playing dead, they were then rescued at dawn the next day by Chinese fishermen. 1,500 POWs died at the end of the Catholic week. We docked at Nagasaki and then out of the hold onto the freezing Nagasaki docks. 50 belated. Some of the men were cracked with their own excitement, and all were barely able to walk. We were met once of the Emperor Elite Guard regiment, who were to be escorted onto the train designated at Yokohama. They were visibly shocked at our condition and did their best to clean us up before boarding the train. Once on the train, quarts of tea were served with meals in individual boxes containing rice, pickles, pork, and vegetables. I can still hear them sneaking, looking in their breath against their teeth in a typical Japanese gesture of disgust as they entered their 50 starving charges. They did everything they could for us, and we were fed again at each stop until we reached Camp 3D at Kawasaki, a suburb of Yokohama. The camp was a hasty, protected wooden structure with our sides a wall made out of half-inch plywood. Canadian chicken coops were built with more concern for the occupants inside. Huts were raised sleeping cities by woven bamboo mats. As the summer went into winter of Japan came upon us, the huts were damp and freezing cold. There were 2 wooden fiber blankets issued to us were injured and suffered in only for the suddenly pursued boxes. We were sent to work on the Nippon Kanshin shipyard, building ships for the Japanese merchant marine. Out of each 14-day period, we worked 13 days and rested 1. We were issued with flimsy work uniforms with our numbers on them. I was Nippon number 7. Then amount of quality of the rations were still a mission. After another year of this, I became little more than a listless, torturing 6 foot. This regime, I became little more than a listless, torturing 6 foot skeleton, unable to work, but hanging motioning into life and for praying something in vain for speedy Allied victory over Japan. I was forced to tramp out the shipyard every morning with my comrades of the work gang, where I was turned over to the civilian foreman who was trustful for my work. He could see I was unable to work and was slowly dying of malnutrition. He was stuck in his breath over his teeth and asked me, using the Japanese word for headman, Hancho, what can we do? Finally, he failed at every job he gave me because I simply could not keep up. He gave me an assignment that required a minimal of effort. At first, strictly away out of the sight of patrolling guards, he had me sit on a little stool, scrape rust from large used bolts with a scuffed wire brush. Another job he gave me was to sit before a large ship boiler and inside could turn rods, one at a time, into pure cut holes. Finally, to keep me more visible to the guards, he had me paint with a large handle paint brush that white aside determination strips of the factory floor, which carbonated sludge. Each day at the workshop yard, where I was forced to go through the motion of work, seemed of never end. The winters were the worst. Japan is bitterly cold and damp in the winter months, and because we had insufficient clothes and had to wore out clothes, the provision insufficient protection from the cold, we suffered in the winter temperatures. There was no escape from the cold, either in the camp nor in the visible freezing work sheds of the shipyard, where I was confined during the day. To keep from going mad, I tried to escape the misery of the present by daydreaming. I tried to free my mind from starving, often ice-covered body by letting score across the blue Pacific to Canada into the warm, carefree, sunlight days of my boyhood. I tried to relive my life with my wonderful mother and my father. I relived our Christmas mornings, our picnics, and our bench parties to Versatile Lake, and I had to serve my parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, and friends at home. Somehow the paralytic minutes and hours tackled by another day of captivity over another day began, as will each passed yet again into another day. How long I wondered was before rescue came, and how long I avoided being the subject of the next hasty funeral and dark at the camp, driven of attending Chantal's priest bells, but like my comrades, I walked again, yet again on another treadmill to the shipyard, and never gave up hope. From time to time, my unfortunate men me to another easy job at the shipyard, that of full manifest shipyard, going in the geese rehearsals on over ships, engine bearings. These easier were made of brass, had a spring-loaded cover, and were called grease caps. For some situation, I never missed an opportunity when undertaking to first fill the grease caps with iron filling before filling the rest of the cap with thick grease. Once the ship was at sea, the head of the engine would slowly liquefy the grease in the caps, and the ironings would begin to burn on. Soon before it would burn out, they were uttered. I was caught, but which was faithful. I had been caught, but the Canadian prisoners at Nippon were forced to work, never ceased to find ways to sabotage and frustrate the Japanese shipbuilding effort. We were not on a sister Japanese war production and had no plans to be one. My fellow prisoners worked in vicious, rather heavy jobs in the shipyard, rolled intricate ribbon on the ships under their respective foremen. We became adept thieves and black market operators who would sell and trade anything for food. We would enter a spot where the foreman looked the other way. I gathered from the floor of the works cafeteria orange peels and other edible leftovers. There was a humiliating experience, but I swallowed my pride with the orange peels. Our black market deal somehow led to painful beatings and even deaths for Japanese civilians and prisoners alike. On June 22, 1944, Private Ververjix of the Winnipeg Grenadiers was accused of stealing a small can of salmon at the shipyard. Ververjix was in my section, and he was taken to the guardsmen for questioning. I accompanied him to defend him and plead his innocence. The Japanese soon determined that he was guilty and that I was lying to save him. They became angry and angry, and they began to scream and work themselves into fury, slapping, punching, and kicking us at random. There was other hands tied to iron grating above our heads. We were beaten with 4-foot staves about 2 inches in diameter. Brunswick was so badly beaten that he was manned for life, and he died on reverse had damaged kidneys. After the war, the 3 Japanese guards, Private Yamaha, Shiga, and Brada, were all tried, convicted, and sentenced to long prison terms for this violent assault upon Brunswick and me. 50 and never quite free from lice. We stanchion on one day, lied another month, and winter gave way to spring and to summer, all while my men were dying one at a time to be cremated after gentle funeral held at night work after work, downing the stay at Camp 3D, and further 26 men died of malnutrition and nutrition. However, the lighter winds of hunger, humor of these gusty Quebecers came to the fore. Soon after we arrived at Camp 3D in Yokohama, the Japanese general in overall command of the Japanese prison camps, came with his routine to the camp to give us a speech. He was a big, fat Japanese. He olive dressed uniform, purse, and a great samurai sword, turning his great guard his side. He was an additional figure, he was swagged into the camp to inspect the guards and to address assembled rocks and the parade ground, large scrolling in their pearl. He was told the prisoners were lucky to be allowed to live. We could have would be executed for any disobedience to the soldiers of the emperor. Japan was winning the war on every front and would soon invade our homeland and subject Canada to Japanese rule. After that occurred, and perhaps for 20 years, we may be allowed to go home. We were slaves with no rights, no hope for anything, and no purpose. At these disrespectful words we've spoken by this scowling, brutal figure, I began to think of the growing power of advancing Allied armies forced to wonder if this man really believed in the nonsense he spoke. We were dismounted and slowly, quietly, we went back to sit on our bedshells huts. Within a minute, one of our French-Canadian riflemen, who was born mimic and comedian, rose on a bed in the center of the hut to command our attention. He soon had us roaring with laughter and arrogant surrender at the genders and the caramel broken English of Japanese interpreter. He did the impressions of them in a perfect intonation of the general, and he gave us a speech and that he foretold that was Japanese scrolling around the well-performing effort, and they interpreted that in broken English of the interpretation Japan was losing the war. He was sorry for all the mistakes they had made. He could apologize for the bad food and accommodations. He was sorry he sabotaged so many of his ships, but he could understand any arrogance and so on, that he rocked with laughter, and we saw that flush of humor that general for that was a blushing brutal bully. He knew Japan was losing the war, and to foster his savage ego, and then suddenly his samurai sword, dragging at the side, of symbolic of backward warrior class, recognition of Japan. Officer Captain Joe Reed was summoned by the Canadians. We were going to resist to the very end, wherever it might be. At Camp 3D, there were some events that stood out. Many memory on October 4, 1944, the air raid sirens sounded. They were warning for the first time on a dreadful clear day. All of the workers in the shipyard, including the prisoners, ran outside to stare up at the cloud sky. They're at 35,000 feet. The sunlight glowing and sparkling from the reflective aluminum skin like silver ghost was a giant American bomber, flashing, photographing Japan at an altitude that the Japanese fighters tried as they could not reach. There was the B-29, the biggest bomber ever built, based 8-hour flight away and newly acquired American bases in the Mariana Islands. We saw this day that the very first events that were not alone. The Allied forces had not defeated us, and we were told the Japanese, and before our very own eyes, Japan was the visible evidence of American military reach and power. Presence of that produced the Viking working bull-eye at shooting range. In the fall of 1944, the Japanese issued us with a Red Cross parasol. It contained 22 pounds of valuable nutrition to supply our product diet. This is to many of us evidence that the military situation worsened, and the captors were reckoning sizes and work lifted. The dead of winter. In March of 1945, just as the high-altitude bombing of Japan affected the U.S. Air Force located at Guam and the Near Islands, changed the bombing charges for Japan. Instead of attempting high-altitude point them of specific targets, such as aircraft factories with high explosive, they decided to drop incursion on the closely packed wooden and paper housing of the major cities of Japan. This became known as the Great Fire Raids that struck terror into the Japanese. As we were close by at Kawasaki, Yamaha, at Camp 3D, we witnessed this fiery holocaust. This first of the raids occurred at night of March 9th and 10th. 346 giant B-29 bombers flew from the sea at altitude only 5,000 feet to bomb Tokyo. Their mission was to drop 60 tons of increased bombs per square mile of the city and burn out the city's residential heart. As the wind night was the refining reached and ground to runs of M69 increased the parts from the bombs could contribute to Japanese fighters. Anti-aircraft guns were taken completely by surprise. They were attempting bombing 20,000 feet. This is a far resistance from Tokyo. Anti-aircraft fighters' defenses had been exposed, and only 12 American aircraft failed to return to their base. By 2 a.m. on the morning of March 10th, Tokyo was flaming into the closely guarded wooden crossing the fire zone. Only Tokyo's fire department rendering useless, but 98 of its heavy fire trucks soon became flaming wrecks. 600 of its fire flame disappeared. The plunged Japanese civilians and the city were begun. More than 100,000 Japanese residents of Tokyo were negotiated that night. 264,000 homes were destroyed, leaving 1.15 million homeless. The next day, American photos, reconnaissance planes confirmed that 15.8 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ashes, but this was only the beginning of the payback for Pearl Harbor. The B-29s came back again on the 13th of April. April 15th, they bombed Kawasaki, the site of our prison camp. They came back again on May 23rd, May 25th, and attacked Yokohama on May 29th. By now, the Japanese air defenses were reeling, and their effortless was returned. The American bomb was bombed before the B-29s through the 216,700 dwellings were destroyed, and put to 6.3 square miles of the urban area of Tokyo had been reduced to ashes. As prisoners watched the unfold before our eyes, we knew that the Allies were closing the ring around Japan, and that the Japanese could not stand the crippling assaults for long. But for now, how long? We watched the power of the U.S. Air Force. Our hopes were raised by we escaped the coming challenge as we watched tons of fire from our camp. Now we were near the end. As we firehousing Tokyo was not enough. The Canadian prisoners of war at Numicon shipyards, Japan's largest shipbuilder, had planned their own to add some dangerous damage to Tokyo's industry sector as well. Under the secret counsel of Staff Sergeant Curly Clark of the bridge headquarters in the dead of night, where the prisoners were back in their camps, mysterious fires broke out mysteriously under the massive blueprint library and warehouse. Their fires were student heading to the feast mastered. The Japanese had did not speak. He seemed unwilling to accept surrender, and one day I asked the other U.S. naval officers at the camp out of the Japanese Philippines, he was of the Navy Sea. Rank of the U.S. Navy was Fashion Plate and Michigan. McDonald tried to Tokyo and Yokohama tried into and 50 caliber machine guns on July 14th, Kawasaki, 1,000. 300 Earl with 2145, firms seen in a Manitoba. December 17th, warehouse of Pearl Royal died. One too small. That's February 21st. Rain started for the February 23rd. A rifle and a grenadier died today. 21st, 1924. At 3:30 morning, where the January 2nd, I was told that were during day, shoveling day, to April 16th. An American named Hannibal Moon Hospital, one small room there has skeleton. If I ever saw one tonight, we were to April 17th. Helen very weak this morning. I was on April 21st. Robley of the Royal Rifles died today at 10 o'clock. He was an electric lag and 600 ton, and of the Japan of 300 who were Canadian, 75 had died. It is assumed and ironic that the Allied forces growing stronger and stronger, though that helped in difficult exile from the camp. That by August 1st, 1925, we still hoped, and we still clung on our dreams rescue. I was demanding hang on. I had fleeing foot wrist, was down 148 pounds, and I knew my circumstances of survival grew less and less each day as I knew there still was a chance. That's the end of chapter 6. I thank the veterans for fighting for me to be free, and I'll do chapter 7 tomorrow. And thank you to Adventure I could be free.